and locally the representations of people like printers and booksellers. And of course what Galileo actually wrote mattered quite a lot, because that was what Ciampoli had to work with. But it's plausible, I think, to conceive of a possible world in which Ciampoli didn't fall, or at least didn't fall quite so quickly or abruptly, and had still been in place when Galileo's book had arrived in Rome. Would the Galileo trial then have happened? I think it's reasonable to suggest that it might not. And the ramifications of that would have been momentous, because it might well have been that Galileo and the Lincei, the Linces, would have succeeded in their aim of making Copernicanism at least an accepted option within high Catholic culture. And that would have been a transforming moment compared to how the history of science and religion has actually played out. It would have meant that that clash never happened. Another reason for focusing on this episode is this. Galileo's case has often been taken as a kind of classic instance, not only for a clash between science and religion, but for a particular view of the powers of media, the powers of the book, if you like. It places a vernacular, modern, secular, public hero in opposition to a Latin, medieval, Catholic, secretive hierarchy, with the censorship, quote-unquote, of Galileo's books, indicating a reaction to the modernizing power of print. And on that account, rather ironically, the reaction against Galileo by the Church would seem to have rested on an essentially accurate perception of the book's powers. Print, according to this perception, produces regular objects that contain knowledge, which then affect or impact readers in ways that we may want to prevent or encourage. But can that perception actually be accurate? If print's decisive property was to create stable typographic containers, as it were, that pass from place to place and I don't know if it will spread or diffuse or disseminate knowledge that they hold, what are we to make of this supreme instance in which the object travelled, not exactly easily, but it did travel, but the reading failed catastrophically? It looks almost as if the reality here is the reverse of the representation. Now I want to move on, having kind of laid that foundation, to talk about the next scientific revolution, just a generation beyond Galileo. By the mid-17th century, the equivalent of the Lincei were becoming institutionalized into the first scientific societies. This is the longest surviving one, the Royal Society in London, which is still going today. We know a great deal about the implications of this for things like experimental practice. But the fact is that it meant a fairly fundamental change in the reading practices in the sciences too, and that's been much less remarked upon. These societies and academies existed in many cities by the late 17th century, not just London, but Paris, Oxford, Leipzig, Florence, Dublin, Copenhagen, many other places. In these places, ways of reading and responding to incoming texts were adopted from the polite conventions of gentility and courtesy, the kinds of things that were inherited from the courts like Rome. But they were adapted to a new kind of collective endeavour, one in which the prince was not usually present. The point of these institutions was, as the English mechanician Robert Hooke said explicitly, to combine attention to books and things. It was a conjunction between experimentation and reading that was at issue here. And it's in this conjunction that we find the distant origins of modern conventions like scientific authorship, peer review, and literary, maybe intellectual property. It's that transformation, the coming into being of those kinds of conventions, that makes the Ciampoli episode seem so alien to us, because it exists before the transformation. And it's also this legacy, the legacy of this transformation, that's at stake now in current controversies about science publishing, online reading, and the automation of reading itself. So the reading practices devoted to experiments differed in an essential respect from the ordeal of Galileo. These were no longer individual acts, they were collective ones. They were carried out in front of an audience that was held to be a participant in what was going on. All experimental philosophers, people in these societies, stressed that for facts, as they called them, to count, they had to be witnessed collectively by the whole group, and ideally on repeated occasions. Their recording and their transmission, their circulation and their use were therefore aspects of civility. And the history of these practices is part and parcel of the history of learned sociability itself. So if you take the Royal Society in Isaac Newton's time, for example, reading here is a social gesture, whether it's in fact carried out aloud before the group or alone, because alone is done with an eye to presentation before the group again. It's the vetting of candidate claims to so for example, where you think a comet is on a certain day, with an eye to, by diverse readers, that qualifies the claims to count as robust, as actual knowledge. So this practice helped to constitute a community and acted as a guarantor that what was published should be counted as knowledge at all. And experimental philosophy rested on this kind of repeated act of collective reading. Participants circulated reports of new facts, experiments, and observations, which had to carry with them a kind of degree of verisimilitude, likeness to truth, to warrant the trust of distant readers. And the recipients then had to respond by giving in more reports of their own, which created a kind of fruitful circulation process. So experiment depended on a widening network of correspondence and printed communications in order to build up this international acceptance of both particular matters of fact and experimental conduct in particular. In the Royal Society in particular, these overt reading practices manifested 4 discrete stages, which can be called presentation, perusal, registration, and circulation. And publication is only one form of circulation. So let me just give you a kind of ideal case. If I went to the Royal Society and gave a book, or sent a book to the Royal Society, not just a book, but a paper of any kind, the process would begin with presentation. This is an inheritance from that old thing where you kneel before the patron, but now it happens before the whole group. Your Champoli, as it were, here is a figure called Henry Oldenburg, who importantly was a diplomat by training, so he knew how to reconcile differences between groups. Henry Oldenburg, the secretary of the society, would take your text and present it formally to the group. And there were reciprocations to that. You would often get a correspondence back, you may be elected to a fellowship. This was a public act then, and it became the starting point for a series of further acts. The first of these was a perusal. A perusal is a formal reading, where 2 or more of the fellows of the society take the thing away, look at it for a week, and come back and issue a report. This is often taken to be a reading by the whole society, and it was advertised as such, for example, by patent medicine salesmen. But it wasn't really by the whole society, it was by just 2 representatives. What was by the whole society, though, was the conversation that then went on as a product of the perusal. These conversations could take weeks or months to work through, and they could get incredibly diverse. So if I brought in, for example, a report about a stone that had been found, a mysterious stone that had been found in my garden, that could lead to all kinds of ramifications. People could talk about ancient history, about the beliefs of peasants, about stones, about the medical properties of fossils, about the weird stories that explorers told about philosophers in other countries, and so forth. All of these things became then the starting points of further circulations. My paper might then be registered. That meant that it was locked away under lock and key, the key being held by the secretary, Oldenburg, with a record of the date and of my name. It therefore associated itself with my authorship. This was a way of protecting the names of the people who submitted, and a way of encouraging people to submit. So the Royal Society became, in its own terms, a bank for intellectual credit. This is quite explicit, this rhetoric. And it's for this reason, because the register grew up week by week, month by month, into a years-long, ever-accumulating record of the achievement of the Society and its fellows, that priority disputes became the kind of key instance of scientific disputes. They were very important, because for now, with this register in being, priority disputes, which had always happened in a certain way, were no longer socially explosive. They no longer blew the community apart, as they did in Galileo's time. They now cemented the community together, because there were shared conventions for dealing with these disputes. And in fact, every dispute that took place had the tendency to turn into a priority dispute because these mechanisms existed. In fact, one of the reasons why reading practices of this kind was so successful is precisely that they generated disputes. Disputes here were not things that were unintended. They were meant to happen. But they were meant to be managed, and they were meant to be brought within the realm of civility. So in Galileo's time, just to give you an instance, there have always been stories, nobody's ever confirmed this, that Tycho Brahe, the famous astronomer, actually had his leading competitor in a priority dispute assassinated, which is a kind of, those were the days. You wouldn't do that in the Royal Society. You would go to the register and appeal to the authority of that. Even so, explosions did sometimes happen, but when they happened, they were especially serious, and they happened usually because some party or other was claiming that the convention of the register had itself been subverted. And what's interesting about that is that the entire career of Isaac Newton can be shown to revolve around a series of processes of exactly that kind. From when he first shows up in the society with a telescope in the 1670s, and withdraws back to Cambridge and refuses to speak to them anymore because he claims that Robert Hooke has been subverting the authorship protocols of the society, right through to the end of his career when he is in charge of the whole system as president of the society and is able to make use of precisely that system to demolish his rivals, the astronomer royal John Flamsteed, the great mathematician Leibniz, who had rival claims to the calculus. Newton, as president of the society, used that registration perusal system repeatedly to secure his own claims to supremacy, and successfully so. And the last thing to say about this is that these protocols extended out into the world thanks to what was called the Society's public register, the first and the longest-lasting scientific journal in the world, the Philosophical Transactions. This is the origin, for those who want to look at origins, of today's scientific publishing scene. Papers that were printed in this journal were ambassadors, as they were called, for the Society's whole way of doing things, for experimental philosophy itself. And it's interesting that when it first came out, nobody quite knew what to make of this organ. It didn't really accommodate to any particular genre that existed at that time, and there are feuds and disputes about people calling it a pamphlet. Was it a pamphlet? Was it a coffee house squib? Was it a libel or something like that? It took a generation or so before people accepted it as being the central circulating vehicle for the sciences. We should remember, though, that all this mediation which Oldenburg pioneered and was then taken up and became the collective norms of the sciences could go wrong, just as it could go wrong if Champollion didn't exist. So one of the most remarkable critiques of the society is actually a play produced in the Restoration period called The Virtuoso by Thomas Shadwell. And the whole, it's very funny, this play, and the Royal Society people clearly thought it was very embarrassing, because it critiques the procedures of the society quite ruthlessly. But what's so funny about it is that the jokes are quite often literal reprints of the contents of this journal, the Philosophical Transactions. So if you can talk, for example, about learning the theory of swimming by pretending to be a frog, in the Philosophical Transactions, that's a piece of science to be taken with respect. In the theatres of London, it's a hilarious joke that had Robert Hooke, the mechanician in the society, cringing with embarrassment when he went to sit in the stalls. It's the same, pretty much the same text. So if you'd lost your mediating reading environment, then there's almost the same pieces of prose could change their status from respectable empirical writing to jokes, critical jokes. So you still needed the collective equivalent of a Champollion in this new public sphere. Okay, let me jump forward again to the 19th century, the third of these scientific revolutions, the one that created modern physics. This is the time when modern disciplines were coming into being in general, specialized, professionalized, highly technical enterprises. It's the moment when William Whewell, the Cambridge mathematician, invented the term scientist to apply to the technical, aesthetic, secular people who did these kinds of enterprises. At the University of Cambridge in particular, a highly advanced teaching culture of physics created the modern enterprise of physics itself. There's a brilliant book called Masters of Theory by Andrew Warwick that describes in detail how this happened and allowed us to reconstruct the reading processes through which it came about. This is James Clerk Maxwell, probably the most important figure in the creation of modern field physics in particular. And this is the book that became the centerpiece of field physics as it emerged. Maxwell's Treatise of Electricity and Magnetism, on electricity and magnetism. In fact, this is one of the last times that innovative science of this kind really got published as a book at all. And it's interesting that Maxwell himself speculated that old metaphor that nature might be a book, or such a thing as